I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's event and thank you all for coming. My name is Jordy Davies. I'm the K-12 policy research intern here at the Century Foundation. And in case you're a little unfamiliar with our work, the Century Foundation is a nonpartisan think tank based in New York City that conducts timely research and policy analyses on a variety of issues. One of those policy areas includes privacy and surveillance, which will help to ground our conversation tonight. This is a kickoff event for our summer networking series for young professionals in New York City, and we're very excited to have started out with such a great turnout. We have a few more events like this one lined up for the summer, and we'll fill you in on those a little later in the evening. Joining us tonight for our discussion on phone encryption and what it means for both law enforcement and all of us here today are two well-known and well-respected privacy experts. First, we have Alex Abdo of the American Civil Liberties Union. Alex is a staff attorney in the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. Prior to joining SPT, Abdo was an attorney with the National Security Project, where he was involved in the litigation of cases concerning the Patriot Act, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and the treatment of detainees at Guantanamo Bay, Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Navy brig in South Carolina. We're also happy to be joined by our own Barton Gellman. Bart is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. In 2013, Gellman was one of 3 journalists to receive an archive of NSA documents from former intelligence contractor Edward Snowden. In 2014, Gellman led coverage by the Washington Post that shared the Pulitzer Prize for public service. Thank you both for agreeing to help shed some light on this somewhat complicated topic that I'm sure many of us here tonight have plenty of questions about. With that, I'll go ahead and turn the conversation over to you both. Thank you.
Thanks for coming out when you could be on the waterfront having drinks. Won't be too late after we're done. I wanted to start off because it's largely it's a pretty young room and you guys are in early stages of your career. I thought it would be interesting to hear Alex talk about how he got into this racket and how he got to start.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks. I'm excited to be here with Bart. You know, I think everyone has their own circuitous path. Mine started in college when I was a biology major, which is what I ended up majoring in. And I was kind of kicking around some ideas, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I took a really interesting bioethics course, which made me start thinking about law school, because I had this kind of naive math going on in my head that law plus biology equals bioethics, so I should go to law school and I can do bioethics work. When in fact, I think bioethics work is a lot more politicized if you want to get into some of the advisory roles. But I got to law school anyway, so there I was trying to figure out what to do. And I interned my first summer at the Neighborhood Defender Service, which is a public defender in Harlem. Really loved the work. After that, thought to try something on a different sort of civil rights work at the ACLU. And I interned at the ACLU my second summer in law school. And after that, just was trying to find a way back. And I graduated. I worked for judges for a couple of years and then managed to find my way back as a legal fellow. And I've stuck around now until they can't fire me as easily.
So now you're mainly doing national security kinds of cases.
That's right.
And we shouldn't let it pass that you personally, as well as the ACLU, had a very considerable victory recently. Alex was the one who argued the case in the Second Circuit here in New York that led the decision in Amnesty versus Clapper that the NSA's Section 215 telephone records collection that's been so much in the news was unlawful. That Section 215 actually did not, of the Patriot Act, did not authorize this bulk surveillance program. What was it like arguing before the appellate judges?
I had my adrenaline was running pretty fast when I first stood up. But it was whatever nerves I had were quickly diffused by Judge Sack, whose very first question, who I think literally 7 words into my opening, which I had thought a lot about, 7 words in, not even really a full clause, he interrupts me and wants to ask this kind of convoluted question about what the case is really about. Is this about email surveillance? Is this about all these things that the case is not in fact about? So that calmed me down, and then afterward it was fun. I think if you don't like standing up, trial litigation may not be for you, but I really enjoy it, and I had to really
They interrupt you constantly, right?
constantly. Yeah, that's just part of the. You know, they don't need your. They don't need you to regurgitate what you've put in your briefs. You know what most people don't realize about oral arguments is that that's the tip of the iceberg. Most of the work is done in the briefs, and some people, by conventional wisdom, say you can't actually win a case at oral argument. You can only lose it by answering or addressing some concern that the judges have that's been lingering since they read your brief in the wrong way. So I think I managed not to lose the case for us that morning.
It seems that you did. All right, so we're here to talk about encryption, and I'm going to give just a couple of words of background here. There are a lot of different elements of the surveillance and privacy debate we've been having over the past 2 years. One of them is the government's contention that the spread of modern encryption technology from its origins with essentially a few geeks and computer scientists to become a pervasive part of the technology we use every day is a huge threat to intelligence collection and to law enforcement. That, as Snowden said famously early on, that well-implemented strong encryption does work, that even the NSA can't break it frontally. Encryption's based on a kind of math problem that's easy to do one way and very, very, very hard, like it would take you 1 trillion years to do it the other way, which is why they can't unscramble the text of an encrypted document. And so for a while now, the government, especially the FBI, have been complaining that they are, quote unquote, going dark, that there are more and more channels of communication out there that they can't listen to or look at, and they're worried quite a bit about that. One thing I thought I'd ask is whether you think the worry is sincere. Do you think that are there hidden motives here, or is it just on the face what they've been saying?
I mean, if the premise is that the internet is going dark, I disagree with that premise. I think in the long term, I think there's no question that encryption will change the way the law enforcement and intelligence agencies do their job. It will make it practically more difficult to access certain communications. But it's hard to understand whether technology poses a threat without assessing the ways in which it's benefited law enforcement. They say it's going dark, but in reality, it's probably never been brighter for law enforcement. Today, so much more of your life is so easily understood through the metadata trails that you can't help but leave when you interact with technology. And so, your lives can be understood quickly, easily, often through subpoenas and not through court-ordered warrants by law enforcement in a way that they simply couldn't be before. So, I think you have to understand the concern in context. But there's no question that encryption will, in certain circumstances, affect the way law enforcement does its job, and that's one part of the balance that has to be considered.
So this public debate got a big push about what now? How long ago was it? It was September of 2013 or 14 that Apple made its announcement.
14, yeah, about
14.
About
so
a year
it's
ago.
less than a year ago that Apple announced that as from its new iPhone, iPad operating system, every one of those devices would come with strong encryption on by default. And that unlike previous versions of the operating system, it would be set up so that Apple itself, even under court order, could not decrypt your phone. They actually took quite elaborate security measures to make sure that happened, and so there are keys built in, unique keys built into each chip of each one of the iPhones, and you put in just a 4-digit PIN, usually, if you're not super security minded, but that gets hashed and salted, as they say in that business, and it becomes a much bigger number, and even at the point of a gun, nobody at Apple could decrypt it. And this sort of catalyzed a renewed debate and sort of freaked out law enforcement, and especially the FBI director, Jim Comey, started saying, how can this be a good thing? Why would you want to have a world in which criminals, kidnappers, pornographers, whatever, you fill in the blank, can put something on the phone, lock it, and then even with a valid court order, the FBI can't get into it. So why would we want that world?
It's a very secure world. It's a world that's secure for free speech and expression and for privacy. But before going to that, I just want to point out it's somewhat anomalous that the debate was kickstarted by this Apple announcement, because in many ways that announcement really should have been a blip on the radar in the intelligence world, because it's really a very, very small part of the problem if you think encryption is a problem, and it's one that should be intuitive. So really what was at stake with Apple's decision and later Google's decision, although they haven't really, I think, fully carried through with it at Google, is whether just your personal device, the device that you own, has its private contents encrypted, which is really no different than the encryption that many, many laptops and desktops come with, either usually not turned on by default, but available fairly easily. If you own a Mac, for example, you can turn on something called File Vault that will do disk encryption for you in a way that nobody but you can decrypt. It doesn't send your key to Apple, it doesn't send it to anyone else. And Microsoft has something similar called BitLocker. So in many ways, it's kind of a very small and anomalous part of the debate, and one not so different from the fact that you might write your journal in code. You might actually formally encrypt it, which some early members of the founders did with some of their journals. The real part of the debate, I think, is what happens when you start encrypting communications in a way that's very difficult to undo. But the question is, why do we want that world?
Yeah, just start. There's a distinction here, right? Yeah. And what Alex is getting at is the distinction between data at rest, sitting stored on something, whether it's your phone or a thumb drive or computer, or in the cloud, just sitting there because you've backed it up to Dropbox. That's on the one hand, data at rest, and the other is data in motion, communications. You send a text message, you send an email. So Comey asked a simple question. I've got a court order. I've arrested somebody. He's got a kidnapping victim in the trunk of a car somewhere. If I could open his phone, I could figure out where, because there's photos or whatever else, evidence there. Why do you want a world in which that's impossible for me?
Well, so I think there are a couple ways to think about the problem. One is that I don't think that we're actually going down, we're going to end up in a world where, because we lack this legislation, people will have access to legislation prohibiting the use of strong encryption, that people will not have access to strong encryption technologies. There are many technologies available currently that allow you to do this very sort of thing without intermediaries like Apple or Google, without having to even pay for them, without going through any of the sort of channels that would be easily regulated by government. So it's a bit of a, I think, a fantasy for government to think that by passing legislation that requires Apple to change the way they encrypt their devices, that all of a sudden sophisticated criminals and terrorists are not going to have access to it. And because I think that is true, I think the area for dispute becomes considerably narrower. We're not talking about the most sophisticated criminals and terrorists either having access to encryption or not having access. We're talking about some subset below that, the kind of less sophisticated criminals and terrorists who wouldn't otherwise go out of their way to have access. So I think that's one kind of factor I think that's important to consider. And the other is that we are now entering the world, the realm of the Wild West on the internet, where every other day it seems that there's a major hack in the news. You surely must have seen the news last week about the Office of Personnel Management of the government having 4 million files on 4 million individuals, including security cleared individuals, hacked apparently by Chinese hackers. There was news today actually that was really remarkable, that Samsung's auto update for their phones is not encrypted, and so is capable of being maliciously attacked in ways that give attackers an extraordinary level of access to your phone. They can turn it on, have it record even when you don't think it's recording. They can change your emails. They can do all sorts of things. That is what's going to be the state of play for the next 20, 30 years without serious work done on the other side to defend our networks and defend our data. And it turns out that our best defense is encryption. The best way to protect information in the first instance is to encrypt it in transit so it's not being monkeyed with as it's traversing the network. And the best way to mitigate harms and risks when someone nonetheless penetrates your network is to encrypt data. The analogy I like to use is it's a difference between breaking into a bank vault and all the money is just out there, kind of like, maybe for this crowd, this would be breaking into Scrooge McDuck's enormous bank vault in DuckTales, and you have all the money and you can dive right in, versus today where you break in and all of a sudden you have individual safety deposit buckets, each of one of which you need a key for. That's what encryption does. It gives you that kind of protection that you wouldn't have without it. So I think that's what's at stake, the security of the internet.
All right, so wait, let me unpack this, because you've covered a lot of interesting ground here. First, there's the question of you could try to outlaw it, or you could try to require companies to provide a second key so that I can open my device, but the FBI can also open my device. But the technology to do strong encryption without that, without respect to U.S. law, is already out there, has been out there for a long time, and so the more sophisticated bad guys are going to use it. And that's true, but you're talking about, a fraction of 1% of the people who right now have the sophistication or the knowledge to use those tools, right? I mean, that doesn't really answer much of the question.
I think that's true in today's world, where you don't have laws mandating backdoors, where you don't necessarily have a strong incentive for criminal organizations to explore, because access is not always guaranteed right now. But if we find ourselves in a world where we do have, where the option is to be a criminal using technology that has a state-created backdoor, or to be a criminal not using that technology and trying to avail yourself of, the many other ones that are available, I think you'll find an increasing percentage shifting that direction. And you're right that a lot of technologies are very difficult to use. A lot of encryption technologies are, but there are many that are not. There are many that are actually relatively simple. Those may very well be used more and more, and they likely are. If you believe some reports, there was a recent recent uptick in the use of some of those technologies by ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Right.
So, actually, there's a little backstory in here that even if you've been following this, you might not know. Go back to the 1990s. Strong encryption had been strictly a kind of a government function, and it took government-level resources to do it. And you had a bunch of hackers who created tools that anyone could use at home, and they were free. And U.S. government tried to regulate that as a munition, prevent the export of it, to forbid the general distribution of this. It was the invention of what's still known now as PGP, which stands for Pretty Good Privacy, but it actually is strong enough that even supercomputers can't break it if you do it right. And they actually did forbid the export of PGP for a while, until the inventor of this software decided he would just take the source code of his program and publish it as a book. Source code can be scanned and then compiled and made into software. The First Amendment forbade the government to stop him from publishing a book full of the source code, and so when 5 minutes later, it's all over the world, if it hadn't already been. So this is a free tool. It's evolved since, but it still works on the same standards. It is hard to use today. It's not very beginner-friendly. But anyone in the world has access to this stuff, and even if the government says to Apple, Congress passes a law, Apple, you can't have strong encryption by default in your product. It'll still be out there available to people, and I think that's your point.
Yeah, and not just that, not just that particular one, because I think you're right. That one is much more difficult for a lot of people to use, but there are websites, for example, that enable fairly secure emailing by doing all the crypto on your computer as opposed to in the cloud. That some are in the U.S., some are not in the U.S. They're very easy to use. The ones in the U.S., if they were banned from existing in the U.S., I'm sure some of those would move, would move their operations outside the U.S. So I think this technology is going to be available, whether the U.S. tries to stop it or not. Right? That's one of the lessons of the internet age, is that it's a democratizing tool that's very difficult to contain. But even setting that aside, so let's take the question for what it is, which is a hard question. Suppose it does have a significant effect in terms of discouraging use of the technology. Is it worth the cost still at that point?
What do you mean? What has the effect of discouraging what?
So suppose you enact, you have a choice of enacting an anti-encryption law or not, and if you enact it, we'll assume for the sake of this discussion that it'll actually be effective. Because one of the points I've been making is that it wouldn't actually be that effective to ban this technology because...
Well, actually, let's move it to what they actually are saying they want. They don't want to ban encryption. They're fine with the iPhone being encrypted. Yeah. They want Apple to insert a second key that the government could use only with a court order, so that most of the time, my key was my key and nobody could get into my phone. But if they got a secret court order saying you're allowed to get into Bart's phone, then they have their own key and they can open it. And they say without that, then the status quo we've had since our founding and long before, which is, that if law enforcement, has a valid authority to go search for something, then they can't get it now. They always could before. There was no physical safe heavy and thick enough that they couldn't eventually open it.
Can I dispute that premise?
Yeah.
So
that's their claim.
So that some of the earliest users of encryption in this country were actually the founders of the country. Thomas Jefferson apparently, when he was in France, would correspond with his correspondents here using encryption. It was a hand-done cipher, which is less secure than what we have today, but there also weren't computers to crack that hand cipher in the way that there are today. And so it was fairly secure for all intents and purposes. And one of the things that he supposedly corresponded about using his hand cipher was the First Amendment, of all things, the crafting of the First Amendment. And beyond that, I think there's this notion that's implicit within the FBI director's statements that with a warrant, the government should have access to everything. And I think there's something about that notion that unsettles me a bit, because we don't require people to organize their lives in a way that facilitates surveillance. We don't require them to, every time they delete a file, for example, create a backup of that file somewhere so that the government could have access to it, so long as it has a warrant. We don't require them to keep early drafts of all their documents, even though they've modified them, so that those early drafts are available. We allow people to shred files. So it's true that encryption seems different in some respects, but it's never been the case that the government can always have access to whatever it wants. And I think what's gone into the line drawing between the two is some sense of the balance. Where should the balance be between government authority and private power to keep your papers private?
So the question is how this changes over time. So let me just do a quick survey. How many of you guys have iPhones? Figured a lot of people would. How many do not set a PIN or use the Touch ID? How many of you could just turn it on? Okay, so you're not encrypted. But everybody who does have a PIN or set it, set the ability to use the fingerprint to get in, it's encrypted. Now, in iMessage, if you're sending a text to somebody, do you know the difference between the blue and the green? So, in case you don't, if it's green, that means you're sending it over the traditional old-fashioned text message, and it's sent in the clear, and the phone company can read it, and anybody else who happens to be sitting on the network, like U.S. government collection agencies. If it's blue, then that means it is encrypted end-to-end. It's encrypted from your iPhone to the other iPhone. You don't have to know a passphrase, or even you don't have to be aware it's happening. But the way Apple designed it is no one can read it in between, including Apple, including the phone company. That's the blue part. And lots of people don't know that now. But as people come to understand that and then start adopting other communications apps, there are a bajillion of them out there. Snapchat is not encrypted, but WhatsApp is now. There are other ones like Signal or SureSpot or Threema or Wicker that are pretty well encrypted end-to-end. As people become more conscious about that and care about it, and it becomes more commonplace to use it, you're going to have more and more of the world's communications that disappear off the FBI's radar. They can't actually read. So do you worry about it in the long term, that you're going to have actually bad results?
I worry about it more in the long term when it does become more commonplace. And I think the balance then becomes more difficult. But I still think that the cybersecurity benefit of strong encryption without a backdoor likely still outweighs the government's interest in being able to read every one of those communications. You know, it's also not as though the government will be unable to read those communications entirely. It'll still have other targeted tools at its disposal, tools like hacking or traditional surveillance that will allow it to do it.
Actually, let's come back to that. I want to make sure we're framing this right. So we have a security interest, just as citizens, if we want to be secure, that the FBI, intelligence agencies can find bad guys and stop them from doing bad things or catch them after they did those things. That's good for our security. You're saying there's a countervailing security interest in having encryption be strong because if the FBI can get into it, that means hackers might be able to get into it too.
Yeah, although
explain that. I mean, why is that a problem? Why is that true? Why is that a problem?
Why is that a problem to have backdoors that?
Yeah.
So, like I said before, hacking or cyber attacks, as any number of government agents have now said, is one of the most significant threats to the nation's national security in the future. And you don't have to look very far in the news to understand how that's quite obviously true. So much of our infrastructure and our economy and our our self-understanding is based on the privacy of an extraordinary amount of information held either in government databases, by your banks, by your email service providers. That information is not just sensitive to you, but it's valuable, and a serious cyber attack can have serious consequences. We haven't yet begun to understand what the consequences are of this latest OPM hack. And so I think having secure technology, as just about every cryptographer or cybersecurity professional will tell you, is the best defense against that sort of attack, that increasingly dangerous, increasingly pervasive sort of attack. And to be fair to the government, they recognize the value of encryption. They're not saying that we shouldn't have encryption. They just want to have a backdoor, a key that allows them to get into. The kind of unique problem with backdoors is that they create single points of failure that will never be kept secret forever. And as soon as someone discovers that point of failure, which they will, that's kind of a tenet of security professionals. If there is a way, it will be found. Then you've created an entire system that is now fundamentally insecure in a way that would be very, very difficult to change overnight. I don't know if you guys remember the Heartbleed bug that was found. I think it was at the end of last year. You guys remember Heartbleed? It was a bug in SSL, which is one of the protocols that's used to establish a secure connection between you and Google, for example. That bug is still not, everyone understood it at the time to be a critical bug in our internet infrastructure, which is still not fully patched because it turns out it's very difficult once you've built systems in a particular way to switch them overnight. Now we're months and months later and we haven't fixed that problem.
Right. Pretty soon I'm going to open this up to questions from you guys. So start thinking of your question and start editing your question so you can keep it short and lots of people get a chance to ask. But I wonder, do you see any room for compromise? Is it either 100% end-to-end encryption if people want it and the FBI can't get in, or there's a backdoor that enables other hackers to sneak in? I mean, is it, right now we have a completely binary public debate. Apple, Google, Facebook, all these other companies are saying, hell no, we are not going to build in a capability to let the government, even with a court order, get into our stuff. And FBI and NSA are saying, this is unacceptable, this can't be what we want. Is there a compromise available?
I would be open to listening to whatever the FBI's technologists propose as a solution to this problem. But one of the startling things about this debate is that there has literally not been a single cryptographer or cybersecurity professional who's stood up and defended the FBI's wishful thinking about building secure systems with this one kind of fatal insecurity. Literally not a single one has come up and said that that is a good idea or something that we can do. And that's in part because...
Well, actually, what they say is it's not possible. They
yeah,
say is we can't have a secure key system that also has the extra key,
right,
or the so-called backdoor. That once you build that, then the whole system becomes insecure.
And there are these other kind of incidental consequences to building in backdoors too. It turns out that writing secure programs and secure protocols is very, very difficult, which is one of the reasons why Snowden, when he was very careful when he recommended encryption to people. He said, well-implemented encryption is secure. And that's an important caveat because it's very difficult to implement this stuff securely. And when you add the overhead on top of your already difficult to design system of a backdoor, that, it turns out, makes it orders of magnitude more difficult because the way the problem is solved is such that when you add the backdoor, it just becomes much harder. You create other points of failure in the system, which I think is why you have all of these cybersecurity professionals saying it can't be done. But if there were a serious contingent of cryptographers and cybersecurity professionals who said it might be possible to do this, I think we should listen to them, to see what the argument is, and then balance it. I suspect we won't have that contingent, and so we may not have to engage that hypothetical.
Right. So I'll just mention one more thing, and I'm going to go to the floor. There are lots of ways that government gets into stuff even though it's encrypted. You can't use your data unless you open the vault, right? So every time you unlock your iPhone, it's not encrypted anymore. It's sitting there open. Same with your laptop. You decrypt your hard drive in order to use it. So when, in the course of the Silk Road investigation, when they shut down this black market internet site run by a guy who called himself the Dread Pirate Roberts, when the FBI went to make the arrest, he was sitting in a library using its internet, and they had two agents whose whole job was to make sure the lid of the laptop didn't get closed. And when they got it from him with the lid open, one of them's whole job was to keep pushing on the down arrow key to make sure it didn't go to sleep. That way, it's not encrypted. It's open. He was using it. So you could do things like that. They do have authority in certain cases to do hacking themselves. They inject malware into your device so that although you think it's encrypted, you're also transmitting the password to them. Or your iPhone, if you're like most people, is probably backed up to iCloud. And there, Apple actually can get into it with a court order. And hackers can too, as a number of Hollywood personalities found out to their dismay. And so, or if they want to know your location, they maybe can't get it off your phone if your phone is locked, but they can ask Verizon or AT&T because your phone has been communicating with cell towers, several times a minute for the entire time it's on, and so they can get a time-stamped location record. They can watch you go around the city and how long you stay places. They have ways of getting at this data. In many, not all cases, they're just not as convenient, and so it introduces an inefficiency that they don't want. I'm going to take questions. I'm going to Lauren's going to have the microphone, and we have agreed to give priority to the young folks who are here. So I encourage you to raise your hands and jump in.
Hi, I'm Kristen. I'm Kristen. I'm a higher education policy intern here at the Century Foundation. So I just had a really quick question about would this backdoor or extra key be limited to the FBI, or are we talking about local law enforcement, so police, et cetera?
I think that's a great question, and it raises an important point. It certainly, we haven't seen legislation proposed that would set the parameters for the use of these backdoors. But if you force companies like Apple to design a system that allows backdoor access, even if you could keep local law enforcement out through domestic legislation, you certainly couldn't keep other countries out through our domestic legislation. And one of the groups of people who use these sorts of technologies are political dissidents in other countries, where very much is at stake aside from they're not being sought because they want to be convicted for legitimate crimes or being sought for political persecution. And so, you know, preventing some of the most, you know, the biggest players in the market for secure technology used by these political dissidents from actually providing that technology would have a real consequence in places where there, you know, is political persecution.
Yeah, you see this. You see this question come up a lot with another part of secure communication, which is anonymity. How do you communicate in a way that doesn't give away your identity or your location or your computer's unique IP address or MAC address? And when people complain about that, I mean, they talk about child pornographers and drug dealers and terrorists using it. It's also used by me as a journalist trying to protect confidential sources, and by human rights workers and by dissidents and so on. So a lot of times, I mean, you could, somebody once posted on Twitter an image of an FBI position paper back in the early first half of the 20th century on the dangers of the automobile and the way that it was going to give criminals these sort of superpowers of speed, and they would be able to use it for robbing banks and getaway cars. And there are a lot of technologies out there that have good and bad uses, and you have to kind of get over it. Who else? I am going to go with young folks first.
Hey there, my name's John. I am curious, we haven't really talked about the distinction between a citizen and a non-citizen. And we throw like FBI and NSA out a lot, but they're two totally different agencies, totally different missions. Is that something that people have been thinking about in terms of what the NSA can do for non-citizens versus what the FBI is allowed to do for citizens? If this backdoor was allowed, would that be split somehow? So for iPhones sold overseas only versus iPhones sold domestically, would there be different things? How is that relevant here?
Well, look, we know in general how this stuff used to work up until very recently, which is that you could go to the company and say, here's a phone, open it up for us. And there'd be, you might have to wait a couple of months because there were a lot of them. And Apple, for example, wasn't in a huge hurry to do it, but they did it. And you had local police, you had federal authorities, you had law enforcement